Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I want to welcome our Zoomers and our live streamers, and I want to particularly thank Pam for joining us again, and Chris Beem for joining us tonight for a great program, we think, on reviving democracy. So before I turn the program over to Pam, I want to introduce her and also let you know about the Q&A. At the bottom of your screen is the Q&A tab. Click that anytime during the program, and your questions will be monitored by Pam, and she does a great job of making sure that all your questions get answered. So keep that in mind and keep the questions coming, because we learn a lot from your questions. So with that, I'm going to introduce Pam, who perhaps many of you know has been the distinguished editor and correspondent for NPR for many, many years, and covered a wide array of issues, particularly focusing on voter issues and poverty, and actually won in 2011 first place National Headliner Award for her work on poverty. So with that, thank you, Pam, for being here and doing the great work that you do. And I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Rhoda. I really appreciate it. One thing she didn't say is I just retired. So, and one of the things I've been spending a lot doing in my retirement is thinking about democracy. So I'm very excited to be here. And I'm going to start a little bit talking about the January 6th hearing. There was another one today. And those of you who watched it would have heard Congresswoman Liz Cheney talk about the fragility of our democracy. And she noted that it was the actions of only a few people that stopped former President Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 elections. And then she said this, quote, "Our institutions only hold when men and women of good faith make them hold, regardless of the political cost. And we have no guarantee that these men and women will be in place the next time." And this is something that a lot of us have been grappling with, how to stop this unraveling of our democracy. And almost 2 years after the attack on the Capitol, we have a wave of election deniers who are running for jobs that could determine how our next election is conducted. We have a large number of Americans who doubt the legitimacy of our elections, who believe our democracy is under attack, and who fully expect violence and even civil war in the not too distant future. So tonight we're fortunate to have with us Christopher Beem to talk about what he believes we need to do to stop this downward spiral. Chris is the managing director of the McCourtney Institute of Democracy at Penn State, an associate research professor of political science and affiliate faculty in the Rock Ethics Institute. He's also a co-host of the Democracy Works podcast and a frequent contributor to the conversation. He's also the author of 6 books, and his most recent is called The 7 Democratic Virtues: What You Can Do to Overcome Tribalism and Save Our Democracy. So Chris, take it away. What do we do? How are we going to save democracy?
All right. Well, first of all, let me say thank you to Rhoda and to the NFRPP for the opportunity and for the invitation. Pam, I'm a huge NPR geek, and so it's very exciting to have you here. I also, in a previous universe, I did a lot of research on poverty, and I remember really paying attention anytime you had an article, because I always thought it was good. So I guess right back at you is what I want to say. The other thing I want to say right off the gate is I'm missing a tooth, and I apologize. It doesn't hurt. I'm going to the dentist on Monday, but I imagine it's a little distracting, and I apologize for that, but not anything I can do about it. So anyway, you're just going to have to deal. All right. So all that said, let me get rolling here. I thought I would talk about one virtue instead. The book is the 7 Democratic Virtues, but I want to talk about one in particular that I think people find the most relevant to the times in which we find ourselves, and that is the idea of democratic temperament. So let me just start there and we'll see where we get. There's a law professor. Now, this is true story. I looked him up, tried to Google him. I know it's true, but I could not find his name. But it's a law professor who has in his wallet a really sorry-looking $5 bill, and he's kept it there for years. And every time he gives a talk, he would always ask everybody in the audience if they could enumerate all 5 rights that are listed in the First Amendment to the Constitution. And, you know, there's always lawyers when this guy is talking, and they all go, oh, no problem, right? Well, let's see, we got freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and he's kept that same $5 bill in his pocket for years. And if you happen to know the answer, I apologize. I'm not going to give you $5, but it just moves the story along. The one that's left out is the right to petition government for redress of grievances. So that's where I'm going to start with the idea of grievance. I looked it up. Merriam-Webster defines grievance as, quote, a cause of distress felt to afford reason for complaint or resistance. Synonyms include injustice, injury, wrong, and all of these words convey, quote, an act that inflicts undeserved hurt. So this is in our founding document. The drafters expected anger and acknowledged the right to express it. And petition of grievance follows hard upon the right to assembly. It's actually in the same sentence, as a matter of fact. So assembly is one essential way that we express our dissatisfaction. Same with the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. These are rights that are associated, that are at their core about expressing anger, about expressing negative feelings. What is more, you can essentially guarantee that when anyone takes advantage of these rights and expresses this anger, that very expression is going to make other people angry. For example, unless you are yourself a Nazi, you probably were angered by the demonstration in Charlottesville, right? But that was a peaceful demonstration. It was freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. They had every right to do it, but it's absolutely without question that they made a lot of people angry when they did it. But that's an extreme example, right? Even at its most benign, political arguments get us angry. So if you say you decide that you think your community, your school district needs to build a new high school or even a new wing on a high school. You think it's going to, we need to adapt new technology. It's going to help property values, and it's important for our children in the community, right? And there's somebody else who says, listen, that's cost too much. I don't want my taxes going up. The school is good enough for my kids. They're good enough for your kids. If you hear that argument, you're likely to get angry. And the more committed you are to the proposition that we should have a new high school, the more likely you're going to get angry. So that's when things are running as we kind of expect them to. That's bottom line anger. Now, in today's climate, anger is far more ubiquitous and far more aggressive than it is in normal times. CNN had a poll in 2021. They asked respondents to think about the way things are going in the country today. 3/4 of respondents, 74%, said they were either very angry or somewhat angry. 3 in 4. So lots of us are very angry right now. But again, even when things are operating as they're supposed to, anger is written into our political DNA. Anger is part of what you sign up for when you're a Democrat. But notice too that there are codified limits to that anger. People have a right to assemble, but there's a modifier, peaceably to assemble. And we have the right to petition for redress. That means we have the right to ask. We don't have the right to demand. We don't have the right to take. We can ask, right? So democracy walks this fine line, and really often a difficult line. And that line is what I mean by democratic temperance. So being a Democrat means you understand and accept, Democrats, small d, obviously, right? Democrats understand and accept that politics is going to make us angry. But we also accept that there are limits to how I can legitimately express that anger. Now, to meet that anger, or to meet those limits, we have to be in control of anger. We can't let anger overwhelm us. And most relevantly, we have to strive to keep anger from metastasizing into hatred. Now, in the book, I talk about the distinction between anger and hatred in Aristotle, but I'll cut to the chase here. Aristotle says that there are three key distinctions between anger and hate. And by the way, research into operation of hate groups, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, what have you, confirms these observations of Aristotle. So, number one, hatred is more likely to be focused on groups. We are more likely to hate a category of people than one individual. And you all know what those categories are, right? When you're saying Jews will not replace us, that's a category, right? So that's number one. Number two, anger is temporary. We get really angry and it goes away. Hatred is more likely to abide. It actually becomes part of our identity. We define ourselves by who we hate. And again, look at the behavior of neo-Nazis, and you can absolutely see that to be true. And then three, the third one, unlike anger, revenge is not likely to mitigate, let alone eliminate the feeling. Aristotle says that with hate, we simply want this group to, quote, cease to exist, which is pretty cold and foreboding language from Aristotle. But anyway, that's there. So this distinction and these three things that make hate different from anger are all relevant right now because of the moment in which we find ourselves. We find ourselves split into two partisan tribes, and our feeling for each other comes at least close to anger. So Aristotle is helping us to define where the limit is. Because if we are no longer angry with our opponent, but if we grow to genuinely hate them, then democracy becomes increasingly impossible. Coalition building becomes impossible. Compromise becomes impossible. And therefore, policymaking becomes impossible. And ultimately, if you hate the other side, elections become impossible as well. Because of your hatred, you're naturally unwilling to accept the victory of the other side in the election. And so hatred, therefore, makes us more willing to break the rules, to ignore the results, and even to resort to violence. Americans, you know, not too many of them could quote Aristotle, but Americans know this to be true. They feel it in their bones. They see what's going on and they understand what's going on. There's two pieces of survey data I want to share. One, there was a poll released in June of this year by Yahoo News that finds that a majority of Americans, 55% of Republicans and 53% of Republicans, 55% of Democrats, 53% of Republicans, believe that it is, quote, likely that the United States will, quote, cease to be a democracy in the future. That's a majority of both sides of that divide. And two, a survey conducted, I think, in August by the UC Davis Violence Prevention Research Program found that, again, over half, 50.1 of all Americans agreed that, quote, in the next few years, there will be a war in the United States. Now, I hope you understand just how dramatically unusual those figures are. But I want to raise them because I take these two polls as evidence that people understand the idea that hatred not only makes democracy impossible, that hatred feeds on itself and may ultimately lead us into civil war. So those are the stakes that we're looking at right now. So I hope it's clear that when I'm talking about temperance, I'm not talking about niceness. There are lots of reasons for Democrats to be angry right now, and I'm not saying that we need to forget that. What's more, I admit in the book that I have myself expressed feelings of hatred towards some of my fellow Americans. It's not uncommon for us to have that reaction right now. So this is not a call for some kind of big group hug. We don't have to like each other. But if we want our democracy to endure, we have to stop short of hating each other. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is easy. It isn't. Living on the edge like this, between acknowledging and accepting anger, living with anger, but keeping a tight control on its expression, living on the edge like this is always difficult, and no one is going to succeed all the time. And all of this is especially true right now. Most of us, as we just saw, are angry, and many of us are flirting with, if we're not full boat into hatred. But this is just one example of the ways in which democracy makes distinctive demands on us. Democracy has a comparatively higher opinion of human nature. Democracy presumes that we know better than anybody else what is in our best interests, and we are capable of ruling ourselves. But for that very reason, democracy therefore demands more of us in terms of oversight and action. So I can't make this easy, but I do have two suggestions that I think can make it easier, that can help us step back from anger into mere hatred. The first one is something that I think we need to stop. We need to stop indulging in media that feed our animosity. There are lots of examples here: cable TV, talk radio, websites, podcasts, etc. And the way to identify this kind of media is that wherever it's found, whatever the medium, you can identify it because it is telling you what you want to hear. When you go to this source, you know before it starts that your group is going to be celebrated and called superior, and that the other group, the other side, the other tribe is going to be called un-American, stupid, immoral, evil, satanic, pick your pick. It's going to be called one of those, right? Now, it's important to understand that there's a reason why these sites exist, why these media exist. When we hear this kind of affirmation, our brain produces feel-good chemicals. It's not dissimilar from good food or sex. That's the kind of chemicals we're talking about. So that's why it's entertaining. And that is why we seek it out. What's more, that is why it's a successful business model. In fact, it is a very successful business model. Giving people pleasure is a very good way to make money, whether that pleasure is good for them or not. And in this case, it's not good for us or democracy. There was an experiment last year where the researchers paid people to go cold turkey from Facebook. They said, you stop Facebook completely and we'll give you some money at the end of these 3 weeks. And most subjects found this difficult, and some found it very difficult. They were on the site several times a day. But after the time away, most said that they felt less animosity toward those on the other side of the partisan divide. Not only that, most of them had a better sense of well-being. It's just, especially right before you go to bed, getting your ire up and getting these kind of, having someone make you angry in a way that's pleasurable is not good for you. All right, so that's number one. If you don't find that possible, then it would do for you to recognize that you are being marketed to, you are being sold a product, and that their objective is to keep you in that product, to keep you watching. So if you know that, you might be better prepared to deal with the effects and to recognize that it's by objective. So that's my negative recommendation. My positive one is to join something, specifically a face-to-face group. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's something that you're committed to, right? Something that you care about or you're interested in. And it could be really anything as long as it's nonpartisan. And that, I confess, makes it harder to find. There's lots of neighborhood organizations, there's lots of churches, there's even many volunteer organizations that are ostensibly nonpartisan, but in reality, they just reinforce our partisan identity, and therefore they reinforce our partisan animosity. When everybody believes the same thing, no one thinks very much. That's Walter Lippmann. But those alternatives are out there, and they're worth you searching them out. So if you think about adult recreational sports leagues or community bands, animal shelters, literacy programs, similar nonprofits that depend on volunteers. Now, I don't want to say that this takes the place of voting. It doesn't. You should go. You absolutely should vote. And you absolutely should support the candidate of your choice. You should join a phone bank if you're interested, knock on doors, etc. But our biggest problem right now is not that too few of us are engaged. Our problem is, as a democracy, that we hate each other. So we need to meet our fellow citizens in nonpartisan settings. And we need to work together so that we come to know each other as individuals. And when we do that, when we're working together for a common goal, and we come to know these people and not as members of this group, then you will find that hate is harder. Now, is this easy? Absolutely not. Not for any one of us. It's very hard to bring ourselves to even consider being friendly with those on the other side. Is it enough? I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes it seems to me like bringing a knife to a gunfight, and then in my darkest moments, it's bringing a throw pillow to a gunfight. The anti-democratic forces are strong. Our undemocratic habits are deep, and they grow deeper every day. And there are any number of incentives in politics and in life that run the other way. But it is a means that we have. And it is a means that is available to all of us. We don't have to have money or power or influence. This is something that all of us can do. And I would argue that it's a sine qua non. Whatever else has to change, and there's lots of things that I support changing, we are unlikely to secure our democracy if we do not rediscover and recommit to this democratic virtue, and for that matter, the other 6 that are in the book. In his essay, Politics and the English Language, which is a great essay, it's very short, it's George Orwell. At the end of it, he writes, "One cannot change this all in a moment, but one can at least change one's own habits." If you want to know what you can do, concentrate on changing your habits. Even if it doesn't work, I'm firmly convinced that it will make you a better Democrat and a better person. And if enough of us commit to it, we have a better chance of preserving our democracy. And that's all I have to say.
That's great. I mean, I found your book, the book, really fascinating. And your description of not only temperance, but the other virtues and the things that need to be done, totally made sense in so many ways. But it was just unclear to me, how do we get from here to there? What is going to make people want to get, not look at the media that reinforces their beliefs, or to not hate people? I mean, what is the thing, the impetus that's going to get Americans now to do that? Because basically everything else you describe in the book is pushing them in the opposite direction.
Right.
It's almost like we're in this downward spiral.
Right. No, it's absolutely true. And I don't understand myself to be a Pollyannish person, but I know that sometimes that's how it comes across. My argument would be, or my response would be, that this is fundamentally a pragmatic argument. And the argument is that democracy is that middle path between tyranny on the one hand and civil war on the other. And when you have half of all Americans thinking that civil war is imminently possible, that means that the stakes associated with our democracy are threatened. There's a crisis with regards to our democracy right now. And it is, I think, easy for us to take that for granted. But if you look around the world and look at places that are not democracies, I really wonder what would be the ground under which you'd say, I would rather live there. I think Americans are deeply attached to their freedom and deeply attached to the idea that other people don't tell me what to do. And so if you believe that, if you really want to preserve that, not just for you, but for your children, then it seems to me that we have no choice but to make our democracy operate better. And so if you believe that, then, you can stand around and wait for the people who are politicians or wealthy to, do that. But there's not really a lot of good reason to think that's going to happen. Most things that happen in politics happen from and through civil society, happens through people saying, we don't like this, we want it to change. And so my argument is, what else you got, right? If this doesn't work, then we are risking things that are very important to us. And it is, there's no guarantee that this is going to work. And it's certainly not going to turn on a dime. But I do feel like their culture is made up of the actions of individuals. And the more individuals who change culture, the more likely it is that we can change democracy. Let me just give you one example. When I was a kid, when I was in college, drunk driving was just kind of something that, you just, you try, you thought about it, but you didn't think much about it, right? And then there were these mothers against drunk driving. And most of those mothers were people who had lost children to drunk drivers. And they came out and they said, this is not acceptable, we have to change this. And it wasn't because politicians said, oh, here's a really good bill. It was because culture, these women mostly changed American culture, and they did it pretty darn quickly too. And so now when my children confront this same issue, it is automatic that they talk about having a designated driver. All I'm saying is culture changed through the actions of individuals, and therefore laws changed. And so if you want to change democracy, that's how you do it.
I'm just wondering, though, some of the things that we're talking about, though, whether or not, you try and stop a legitimate election or not, are a little bit different. I mean, you really have two opposing sides, a lot more than you would say even with the drunk driving.
Right.
laws. And isn't one, and you raise this in your book, but that one of the problems could be, you know, if the people who adopt these virtues, who are more temperate, who are more, try to make themselves more understanding of the other side, if it is one-sided,
Right.
does that not pose more of a risk to the future of our democracy if it's just one side?
Yes.
You quoted this a little bit before. You said if democracy is valued by one side more than the other, you talk about bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Right. No, I mean, it is simply the case that democracy is not religion. Religion demands behaviors that obtain irrespective of the behavior of the other person, right? You know, Jesus said, you're supposed to forgive 70 times 7, right? Democracy is not that. Democracy is about all of us taking on a share of sovereignty. And so democracy is at its heart reciprocal. And if it's not reciprocal, it just doesn't work, right? And so there is an absolutely a possibility that, you know, when you're trying to, develop some kind of standard of behavior and it's not responded to or not reciprocated, that you're going to look like a fool. And there's no reason why that's okay, why that is something that I or anybody else should be demanding of you. But it is also the case that you should not presume that that is going to be the reaction that you hear. What democratic charity is the idea that we give each other the benefit of the doubt. And that doesn't mean we keep it, and it doesn't mean that we don't let evidence talk us out of it. But we start our interactions, we start our exchanges with the presumption that we are all Americans. We love our country. We love our children. We're trying to do the best we can. And this is genuinely how I see it. And, I'm not going to tell you it's going to work every time. It's not. But, I have this whole long thing about game theory. And, game theory says that, the best strategy for the long run is called generous tit for tat. So that means that you respond in kind most of the time, right? If somebody treats you badly, you treat them badly the next round. And politics is the game that never ends, so it just keeps going and going and going. But randomly, for no good reason, every once in a while, you try again. And you say, maybe this time. And again, this is not me being nice. There's data here that shows that over the long run, this is the strategy that is most likely to create cooperation. And so whether or not it's easy or we like it, and whether or not we can predict with confidence that it's going to be responded to in kind, it's still, in the end, the smartest strategy for, I guess what I would say is these kind of individual actions, right? Actions between us and other people.
And I'm just curious, do you see something happening that could really be an impetus for this? Because, some people might have said, well, January 6th would have been shocking. Let's bring bring people back from the ledge. And
it actually kind of did for like 2 weeks, right?
Right. And certainly 9/11, just sort of brought so many people together. Mm-hmm. But if January 6th didn't, oh wow, what is the thing? Can you envision something that would?
I'm really tempted to go. There's something on my door from Gertrude Stein. I'm not going to get it right, but basically, it's the quote is, nothing is ever going to change until suddenly everything changes.
Right.
And I think that's right. It is going to be very difficult for us to foresee this or to predict it, and God knows nobody wants another 9/11, you know, as a way for this to get resolved. You know, I think we have little choice but to keep trying to work towards that event. But I don't know that there's any real prospect or obvious time that it's going to happen. I do feel like the one thing that I think is entirely possible is that this level of animosity is exhausting. It's tiring, right, and it's frustrating. And once people come to recognize that civil war is a terrible idea and splitting apart is impossible, and that therefore there's no choice but for us to try to figure out how we're going to live together in some measure of peace and stability, then they'll just say, well, you know, let's give it a try. You know, I mean, again, I'm not saying that it's just right around the corner. It's not. I mean, it took us a long, long time to get here, and it's going to take us a long, long time to get out. But I do feel like there is reason to expect that sooner or later this flame is going to burn itself out.
I'm going to ask you one more question.
Yeah,
and
please.
We'll go to the audience.
All right.
We do have a number of questions. And it's more of a personal experience. One of the things that I have been doing since I retired, I've been working with election officials just on how to deal with misinformation. And as part of that, what I've been doing is spending a lot of time actually monitoring and listening to and working with some of the election denier groups specifically in Pennsylvania, just to find out. And I've gone to a couple of their meetings. These are groups that feel like they have to watch every single thing in the election because there's lots of fraud there. And if they're not watching, there will be fraud. And one of the things, and my husband thinks I'm nuts because I also listen to Steve Bannon's War Room religiously because I just feel it's really important to know where people are coming from. But one thing, when I was at some of these election integrity meetings in Pennsylvania, some of these people, they're so sincere. I mean, they really want to preserve democracy. They feel like their votes are threatened. They are very patriotic. And I'm not talking about the people who are intentionally misleading.
Right.
I'm talking about the people who really believe that there is a threat to their democracy.
Right.
I keep feeling that there is some common ground there. Is there some way to tap into that to address this broader issue, right? I mean, how do you tap into that? I mean, they're very committed. They're true Americans. They just feel really strongly and they want to do something. I mean, they really want to act. So how can the people more like me, and I assume you too, who feel like, okay, we have to protect this election system that we have right now in these democratic institutions, how do we work with those people? I mean, how do you tap into that to make, to find common ground?
Yeah. I mean, it is, it's really hard because, I mean, there is these claims about election fraud, about, a stolen election exist and continue to exist despite the fact that there simply is no evidence. So it's hard to know how you argue with someone who simply is not open to argument, right? And I do think that there's a point at which, if that's the case, then I think you do have to kind of say, what is the point of arguing, right? But I also agree with you that there is this kind of, sense of patriotism that is behind a lot of things these people believe. I mean, all of us want to think of ourselves as being good people, moral people, good Americans, et cetera. And so I would argue that there are moments in our history, American history, in which our differences became less operative, less important because we had something else we had to attend to, right? And so I feel like arguing around in that kind of context, right? And arguing for the fact that people who don't agree with you are not satanic, right? In other words, if I go into one of those meetings, and I would not be so concerned to convince people of that they're wrong. I would be more inclined to convince them that I was a person of goodwill and that I was operating towards the same ends that they are committed to, that I am, I love my country and I want to see elections be secure. And so maybe we start by talking about whether, not to say there is for sure, but whether there might be something that we could agree on about elections. And, and start with the idea that it's simply not plausible that everyone who lines up as an election denier is a good person, and everyone who who says that the election was run fairly is a bad person and is on the make. It's simply not plausible. And so, I mean, again, I think some of that just has to play itself out. I don't believe or expect that kind of argument is going to have much impact on many of those people.
And so one of the questions we have here is from, and if I apologize if I mispronounce somebody's name, but Pepita Soto, who says, should we not want to be literate in all media? Should we only listen to what he says to NPR and read the Washington Post, which I think kind of gets at that a little bit, that maybe we do need to expose ourselves to what other people are listening to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is, unless you have a lot of time, certainly more time than I do, I would limit myself to media sources that are committed to truth in some manner. And so that doesn't mean that I would limit myself to media that conform to my own partisan point of view, right? I mean, there's plenty, well, not plenty, but, The Economist is right of center. I read it all the time, right? Because it's a really good publication. And I know that there is a commitment to journalistic integrity, irrespective of where they come down on some of these issues. I think there's less of that. I don't see that so much in the Wall Street Journal. I don't see it as much as I used to in the Heritage Foundation, certainly not in Claremont Group in California. So, I mean, I think there is an issue with regards to this. And obviously I'm defining myself in a partisan way, but I also think that it is, what are you trying to do when you're listening to news, and it seems to me, your primary objective is to determine, to learn about what's going on, to learn what's happening. And to do that, you need to trust the source. And so I would, in terms of how I would invest my limited time, that's what I would do.
I should tell you, I do learn a lot from listening to Steve Bannon, only about what they're talking about, not necessarily about the world. But.
Yeah, right. Or what's really happening, right? Mm-hmm.
Right. And this is an interesting question from Stanley Goodman, and he says, the survey results that you mentioned about how majorities of both parties believe that we could have another civil war or that it might be imminent.
Mm-hmm.
Is that real? how unusual is that? He said, American history is full of periods of hate, hate of minorities, hate of equality.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. But we're talking 50% of Americans is over 100 million people. And that is new. The degree to which this idea has filtered down. I mean, it happened once before, right? And there was a civil war, right? And so it's not that Americans, commonly agree. They just don't, right? But it is the case that even in the midst of the 60s, when there was, more violence than there is now, and, some very strong, virulent disagreements between the left and the more traditional and, more traditional right, and then the more racist right, it was still the case that people were not talking about civil war. Or splitting up the country. I'm not saying that was completely absent, but nothing along the lines of what we're talking about now, not the numbers. This is a distinctive time in American history.
And again, it just seems to be feeding upon itself.
Right. I call it the doom, or I stole it. The doom loop. Right. Yeah. And I think that's right, because this does reinforce. And when you are part of a tribe, what ends up happening is that your views, as a matter of research, as a matter of data, when you are surrounded by people who think the same way you do, you are going to become more strident and more strongly committed to your point of view. And so, and because our split is so overwhelming, it's not about partisanship. It's not about policy positions. It's about identity, right? I do this thing in class where and it's one of the few things I know is going to get reactions. I'll just start talking about institutions, social institutions, and just say, you tell me red or blue. And then I just start talking. If I say I have Prius, oh, blue. If I say Chick-fil-A, oh, red. And you can just go on and on and on. NASCAR, red. I mean, it's just, we have separated into two cultures. And that makes it all the more easy for us to hate each other.
And actually, that was one question. Other question I had was that you do talk about the tribes, and basically two tribes, the red and the blue tribe.
Right.
But what about what about the Liz Cheneys of the world, or the people who don't fall into one category or the other, or all the Americans who really don't spend that much time even focused on politics?
Right.
What impact, how do they come into play in all of this?
Well, first of all, Liz Cheney is by my definition the epitome of courage, and the courage that we need right now, because she's paid serious price for her behavior, for her choices, and she
went against the tribe. Right,
exactly.
Right.
And that's the harder courage right now. It's not hard for us to be in our tribe and stand up to members of the other tribe, right? That happens all the time. But for us to actually say, in the context of our group, I think that's overstated, or that's not what they would say, or, well, they're not they don't have three heads. They're not evil, whatever it is, right? That is the hard thing to say. And so I would say, I don't think Liz Cheney, from a policy point of view, I don't think she and I would agree on the color of the sky, but we do. I mean, I do find her to be an exemplary human being as far as this goes. She is putting the fate of her democracy ahead of her own partisan instincts and ahead of her own self-interest. And that is a lot to ask of somebody. As for these other people, there are a lot of people that identify as independent. They say they are. The evidence is pretty clear that they're not all that independent. Most independents track one side or the other. And there are people who don't, but those are the people who just don't care about politics. And even those people are usually culturally associated with one group or the other. So there may be people who don't care about politics, but they're still more likely to go to NASCAR and Cracker Barrel, as opposed to some who don't care about politics and they go to Whole Foods and Starbucks. So it is. Yes, it's not ubiquitous. And there are also, I mentioned in the book that I saw a Subaru, which is definitely blue, with a big gun right sticker on the back of the car, right? So it's not like it just tracks completely. But what it is fair to say is that there is a current. There's a blue current and a red current. And it is challenging for us to swim against that. And it's just psychically easier for us to go along with it.
So we have another question here. This is Lee Chinitz, and she says she read the book and she loved it.
Oh, that's nice.
Throw that out there. Should I stop now or?
Well, maybe, but
no. Yeah. So, however, I too am concerned that if the only solution is that people have to behave better, we are in trouble.
Yeah.
Am I wrong to think that one side of the political divide is much more likely to be amenable to this idea that we need to embody these democratic values than the other side? You say that Americans are attached to their freedoms, and yet much of what we see from one side of the divide seems like people who are actually more interested in authoritarian rule. Tell me I'm wrong.
Well, you're wrong in this sense. They're absolutely committed to freedom, but they're committed to freedom for themselves, right? So freedom for Christians, but not freedom for Muslims, right? And so that is how they would understand it, and that's why we're talking about Christian nationalism, et cetera. I completely share that point of view. And so I don't want to argue that that this isn't likely to be more receptive to one side than the other. I mean, I start by talking about, January 6th. If you think that January 6th was, what did they call it? Political discourse or something like that. And, or if you think that it was patriots, or if you think it was Antifa, well, I really doubt that my argument is going to have much appeal to you. But I can tell you that I have friends and acquaintances who are very much on the right, and they are not as receptive to this, but they are not going to argue that any of these virtues is by its nature partisan. Right? There's nothing democratic or anti-Republican about honesty or humility or consistency, right? And I think if we start there, then we can at least make some entrees into this other community. And I also, there are strident, intolerant people on the left as well, right? And so, I just think they're not quite as powerful right now, but not to say they're not out there. So, yeah, it's a difficult challenge in which we find ourselves. The only other thing I would say is, look, virtues, as Aristotle makes very clear, the whole point of the book is not to become a good person. It's to become an excellent person. It's to become the kind of person that lives up to the best that is in all of us. And so whether or not it works as a political strategy, it's still worth doing. It's still worth being a person who manifests these 7 virtues. And the more of us who do that, the more of us who strive to manifest these virtues, and just one more thing, the more people are willing to laud those behaviors when they see them on the part of others, right? So when we are willing to say, Liz Cheney is one of the most courageous people I'm aware of right now, that is a way of communicating the nonpartisan democratic dimension of these virtues.
So there's another question here that Chris Ravishankar, and it brings, and I may be misinterpreting the question. I hope I'm not. I will read it, but also I think it's, are we divided into these two tribes because of our own free will? Are we making free decisions? And he says, what makes you think that the two tribes are intentionally not created and being manipulated intentionally just to keep the people separated, and thereby no concrete laws can be passed, and thereby a few wealthy individuals control everything by paying off the money-minded centrists? And I mean, that is kind of an interesting question, because how much of our attitudes are we really coming to on our own, or are we being manipulated?
I mean, as I said, there is a current, right? There's a current that exists for both tribes, and it is extremely hard work psychically, right? It takes an enormous amount of energy for us to combat that current all the time. Most of the time, we're willing to just let the current take us along. So I think in that sense, it's probably fair to say that yeah, we're not entirely conscious of this. I think I would disagree, with the idea that this whole thing is a nefarious plot to make rich people rich. I do think there is a moment in American political thought now where, what many would call neoliberalism, where the idea that we can't agree on any other value, but we can agree on money, and we can agree on maximizing my own wealth, and that we are all branding and we are all marketing ourselves. And I do feel like there's a hole in our discourse for a better, more humanistic sense of virtues and values and what's important to us as human beings. And so I think in that sense, it is true that because there isn't enough of an alternative to that narrative, that people have, that it helps gravitate people into this, into these tribes. But I also think that it's imprudent to give these elites too much credit. Most of them are just as clueless as the rest of us. And if you've anyway, I mean, I think the prospect of that being a deliberate strategy is, I find that a stretch.
But it is interesting. I mean, we do have this evidence that there are external forces that are trying to influence our debate,
sure,
whether or not it's the Russians or the Chinese or some of these, very moneyed interests, even within the United States.
No, that's absolutely true. And because of the, the collapse of campaign finance reform with the Supreme Court decision, billionaires can invest billions of dollars in terms of, creating markets, creating opinions, pushing, people to believe something or to act on something. Absolutely, that's true. And, maybe they are that good that they're thinking 3 steps along the way of putting this all together into some kind of package. But I think most people like that are doing it. I mean, there are people, most of those people genuinely believe that a free society means that there should be as minimal restrictions on profit and on corporate activity as possible, right? They genuinely believe that that is the best way to organize society. And so when they push for politicians or priorities, it's not that they're just doing that to make more money. It's doing that because they really believe it. Happens to be that what they genuinely believe is also what's going to make them more money, but that just means they're biased, and that makes them no different from anybody else. We are all biased.
We have, I guess, probably just time for this one last question, and it's from Jenny Smith Wilson, and I think this is a very interesting question. She just says, are there historical parallels from other countries to consider as we traverse this time in our democracy?
Wow, that's a really good question. And I'm going back to this, and it was a long time ago. It was graduate school, so you can tell that was a long time ago, but it did make an impression on me when I read it. And it's kind of ironic and tragic because it's about Venezuela, and Venezuela now is just in terrible shape. But shortly after its founding, the people in charge literally gave up power because they realized that it was in the best interest of the nation to do so. I mean, I don't feel like I or anybody else has a right to expect that standard of behavior. But I do feel like it is reasonable to expect more of ourselves, right? I mean, we were duct taping people to airplane seats. That is not normal. That is not acceptable for a civilized society. We should be able to do better than that. And so if that's going to happen, it's going to happen by people saying, that's unacceptable. And seeing something else and saying, that's much better. I really applaud you for doing that. And I'm talking about virtue that is, I'm striving to separate it from any kind of theological point of view or anything that's sectarian. These are democratic virtues that we need to sustain our democracy. And given that, most of us think democracy is a good thing, it's worth at least giving this a shot.
I'm just curious if you see, besides Liz Cheney, other areas that give you hope, that other people who are doing things that are what you think need to be done to stop this doom loop.
Yeah, I mean, the incentives operate the other way, right? Consistency is a way of demanding justice from ourselves and from other people. If we think it's wrong for my tribe, it's wrong for that tribe. If we think it's good for our tribe, then it's good for that tribe. And we should strive to do that. I think most people recognize that in the abstract. I think most politicians run from it like the plague, right? Because it does them no good among their constituencies, and especially in their primary, to say that, well, since I said this time, I should probably not say it, or I should probably say the same thing about my own side. I'm trying to think. I just saw it, but and I can't recall it, but it happens frequently, right? Can I point to an example where somebody did it? No, off the top of my head, I can't, but we can do it, right? We can do it. And we can say that when we see somebody behaving in a way that is, honest or courageous or temperate, that we can say, whether or not they're on our side or not, we can say, I really appreciate that you did that. I really value that kind of choice you made. I mean, I think that, I don't know what else yes, we should all vote. Yes, we need to do our part to make sure that people who are, that there are people who should no longer be in power. And, whoever you think that is, I certainly think it. But beyond that, we need to, there's little we can do. We're not going on CNN. We're not going on, I don't have $1 billion, but we can do this. And so if you're looking for something to do, something that you can do, then I think this is worth a try. It's certainly not going to hurt you.
And I'm wondering if, the answer really comes outside the political structure. I mean, you mentioned before, the civic society,
Civil society, yeah.
The civil society.
Yeah.
Do you see an area there where it?
There's a lot of people, I'd say more political scientists than not, talk about ways to reform the political process. And, so they'll talk about a lot of different things, right? Making Election Day a holiday, ranked choice voting, campaign finance, lowering the voting age to 16. I mean, there are literally probably 20 that I could come off the top of my head. I am open to just about all of those. But I also think that, where you have ranked choice voting, for example, Maine, that did not happen because of politicians. It happened because of people pushing that agenda such that politicians had to listen. Politicians are not Profiles in Courage. I always joke that Profiles in Courage is a very thin book. And so if you're looking for that, you should stop. But if you want to change a politician's incentive structure, that requires civil society.
And Rhoda, I don't know, do we have the time for more questions or what? She's the boss.
Those are really good questions.
We've got.
Can you hear me? Am I back?
Yes.
We can hear you. There you are.
Here I am. So, my God, that was astounding, Chris. And so much food for thought and really good things to think about. Pam, thank you so much. Pam, did you get to bring up all the questions? We like as much as possible to get most of them answered. And I'm not sure if that happened.
Well, probably about half of them, but I tried to get one from each of the people who were asked, because some people asked several. So.
Okay. All right. Well, then I want to thank you so much for a great program. Great questions. I think I learned a lot, and I have a feeling that the audience did as well. So we appreciate that so much. And for those of you still participating, I urge you to go to the NFRPP website, sign up for notices of future programs, and learn more about the kind of work we do and what our mission is, which is basically to educate and bring credible, reliable information into the public arena, as we did tonight, and get discussions like we did tonight. So we're very thankful for this food for thought, and hope we take away a lot of things to think about and step up and do the things you said, Chris. I think those were great suggestions.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the time, and thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yes, and I do think people should read your book. Can you see it? Oh, that's backwards. Okay. But anyway, people should read The 7 Democratic Virtues. And if you go on our website, you will note that we have a 30% discount being offered for that book, and we will help you get that 30% discount. It's really good. Yeah, really a good read.
Well, so
thanks again, and thank you everybody for joining us. And we hope to see you next Thursday when we do a program that's going to update us on the Ukraine with the same speakers and moderator that we had in May. And there's a lot to talk about on that issue. So look forward to seeing you all back. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Pam.
Yeah.